Bitcoin getting crushed again. It is now off 16% since hitting all-time highs earlier this month.
But the bank also pointed to tens of billions of pounds in extra savings by households who have not been able to spend, but at some point could be unleashed. Another much-needed shot in the arm.
Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another episode of Focus on Finance. In today's episode, we are covering Islamic finance and Islamic banking. Joining me in the studio once again, I have Niazi Hoolash, an accountant by profession, and Shameem Jamal Ahmad, a missionary based in Mauritius. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
In today's program, we have a long interview with an expert on Islamic finance and banking, Ahmad Salaam Sahib from the UK. I started by asking him to introduce himself.
Salaam. My name is Ahmad Salaam, and I'm a pretty much career investment banker and finance specialist. I've been in the industry for over 35 years now, and within that time period have been quite actively involved in Islamic finance. I was the founder director of the first Western regulated Islamic bank, called the Islamic Bank of Britain, back in 2000, and we created a bank literally from zero. We spent a few years with the regulators, including the Bank of England in the UK, explaining Islamic finance to them so that they could put in regulations that allowed Islamic banks to sit alongside conventional banks. And that's the first time, and it's still the only time that has been done around the world. Within the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat, I had the honor of serving the Jamaat as a national secretary for Sunnat al-Tijarat, which of course is the trade and industry department within the UK Jamal.
What is your definition of Islamic banking and Islamic finance?
As you know, and our audience may know, the origins and basis of Islamic banking are governed essentially by Sharia law. And the Islamic law is derived from both the Holy Quran and the sayings and deeds of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. And the financial Sharia law rules that encompass an allocation of resources, capital market activity, that means debt and equity, and the distribution of income and wealth and inheritance. And typically in the Islamic industry, we have a panel of Sharia scholars who give their fatwas, either judgments on whether a particular product or structure is compliant with the laws of Islam.
How does Islamic finance treat interests?
And if you look at Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 275 to 281, I'll just read the translation in English. That those who take riba will not stand but as one that stands whom the demon has driven crazy by his touch. That is because they have heard trading is but like riba. Whoever receives an advice from his Lord and stops, he is allowed what is past, and his matter is up to Allah. And the ones who revert back, those are the people of the fire. There they will remain for Allah forever. Allah destroys riba and nourishes charity, and Allah does not like any sinful disbeliever. So there's a very clear instruction there not to take or receive or pay riba. Of course, the question inevitably is, what is riba? And that's where there's still a great deal of debate and discussion amongst scholars as to how we should be defining riba.
How would you define riba?
Well, I'm very fortunate that typically, from a professional perspective, riba has been defined as a predetermined rate of return, which is almost a guaranteed rate of return. There is no risk to that rate of return. For an investor who has money to invest in the project, there's no risk to that return subject to things going normally. It's a guaranteed rate of return. That's what happens with a savings product when you put your savings into the bank. Or if you're borrowing, then you always have to pay interest, whatever happens to the underlying reason that you borrowed the money for. So if you borrow money to buy a house, but the price of the house goes down, you still have to repay the full amount that you borrowed plus the full amount of the interest. So that's the typical definition of riba. There is, however, a secondary school which is now developing. And in fact, I was very fortunate that I was at a meeting many years ago when the late Sir Joseph Khan was asked about the definition of riba. And he said that in his interpretation, riba was not an ordinary rate of interest. It was a usurious or exploitative rate of interest. And so there's a very subtle difference there. But if you think of it in the context of how Islam was really following on from the teachings of Christianity and Judaism, then you had the money lenders who were sitting in the temples then, lending money at exorbitant rates of interest to merchants who then had really no control over their business. So, for example, if a merchant in Arabia was buying goods to take from one country to another, one side of the country to another side of the country, and he had to borrow money to buy those goods that he transported, the money lender would typically get his full money and his full interest payment back. He would not be taking any risk if the caravan that was carrying the goods ran into sandstorms and the camels wandered off and the poor trader lost all his business, etc. So the interesting thing, of course, is that the prohibition of interest is not limited to Islam, but is shared by Judaism and Christianity. Some of the Old Testaments have rendered interest as forbidden. We see that in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and the Psalms, and the Proverbs, and Ezekiel all refer to the prohibition on interest. And it was actually in Babylonia in 700 BC that the Ajibi Bank was established, which functioned exclusively on an equity basis, that is, without paying or receiving interest. So it's something which has been around for a very long time indeed. And obviously, from an Islamic perspective, it's been around 1,300, 1,400 years that we've had this instruction on the prohibition of interest. So there is still some debate, and it's interesting how other scholars are also looking at riba now as a usurious rate of interest rather than a normal market rate of interest.
So, in that school of thinking, non-usurious levels of interest is allowed?
In that school of thinking, exactly. So if they think if you have a fair rate of return, which is allowing for example, for inflation and the way that inflation eats into the value of money, then perhaps that regular rate of interest would be acceptable to those scholars because it's not exploitative of a borrower or a lender. That's the interpretation that this school is putting out there.
So Ahmad, Salaam covers some of the aspects we've covered before in our program, notably the one on interest where he talks about riba. But he mentions an interesting aspect about interest rates in some schools of thought. Remind us what Islam teaches about interest.
Well, Islam is very clear in its teachings about interest, and this is what Ahmad said, referred to when he mentioned the verses of the Surah Al-Baqarah, where riba in all its forms is categorically, not allowed in Islam. And Alhamdulillah, we as Ahmadis, we have accepted the promised Messiah of our time. And one of his function, as defined by the Holy Prophet ﷺ, in one of his sayings, that he would come as the Hakam Adal, as the just judge, because we will have so many school of thoughts on so many issues, riba being one of them. But these days we have school of thoughts and we have diverging opinions on so many things, even on the basic things like salat, like Saum, like fasting. So on all these things, the promised Messiah ﷺ came and taught us and not taught us, but actually highlighted what was the real Islamic teachings. So about riba, the Prophet ﷺ clearly said that in all its ways and forms, it's not allowed. Riba is not allowed in Islam. Yes, there's one way where the interest money could be spent. It is for the propagation of faith. This was the only avenue that the Prophet ﷺ clearly said, apart from that, interest is not allowed. in Islam is not allowed for Muslim.
So we're not allowed to use and not allowed to charge interest.
Yeah, I mean, based on Islamic principles, definitely. And when I hear that, probably the other area worth exploring is then how does a Muslim who wants to practice Islam in full live in a society whereby at times without wanting it, you're getting interest. So one of the ways which I can react to what Rabbi Shameem side has been explaining is that if you're earning interest, you can use that money and spend it in the propagation of faith in a certain way. At times, if you're paying interest, okay, if you've got the mortgage, etc., then I guess, my point of view is, I think there are many people, okay, who have mortgages, etc. I think the whole idea is how to steer away from it, to keep it the minimum possible, but probably in some other program, we should probably focus on what are the ways and means to lead our lives in such a manner that we stay away from anything that has interest. I think there'll be something interesting to explore.
To add on that, Shafique said, yes, people are involved in mortgages today, unfortunately, but the basic principle is that if it is for genuine needs, we covered that briefly in previous episodes. For genuine needs, then a roof, food and some health, yes, maybe you could get be involved in loans and maybe then there will be interest to pay. But for wants, for things that maybe you don't need really to live, and for luxury items, then this is certainly not something which should be encouraged.
Yes, thank you. Let's hear a bit more from Ahmad Salaam on the Islamic finance as currently practiced in the economy.
Yeah, I mean, compared to the normal market, of course, it's an absolute pinprick in terms of normal finance. The Islamic finance industry claims that there's something like $3 trillion of assets in the industry. But if you think one bank, HSBC, for example, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, that has a balance sheet of $2.2 trillion, just one bank, on a UK bank. So for the Islamic industry to be worth $3 trillion, it's an awful lot of money, but on a global scale, it's tiny.
Can you provide some specific examples of Islamic finance?
Yes, of course, delighted to. So typically in Islam, you have to remember certain things. That if you assume the definition of riba is a simple interest rate or a guaranteed rate of return, then there's a prohibition on that. And one of the things to remember in Islam is that money does not have any value in itself. It is a means of exchange. It is not an asset. And that is the essential difference between Islamic finance and conventional finance, that money has no value as such. And in Islam, the emphasis is very much on risk sharing. And people who are the suppliers of money, suppliers of funds, they become investors instead of lenders to a particular project or a particular business or a particular individual. And in Islam, the provider of financial capital and say a borrower or it won't be a borrower, an entrepreneur, share the business risks in return for a share of the profits and a share of the losses. So it's very much an equity-based system, which allows you to put your capital into a project, into a business, and share the profits and rewards, or equally share the losses in a predetermined way. And that's essentially what Islamic finance is all about.
What kind of products are available under Islamic finance?
And this is where, of course, one has to be fair, that, and I should just state that I'm fairly skeptical and cynical about the state of the Islamic industry now, because I think it has not progressed and been as innovative in its thinking. And very often, all it has tried to do, and all the Islamic banks, they try to mimic what is available in the conventional finance model. So, for example, as you just mentioned, mortgages, car loan finance, personal borrowing, they try to find structures which fit the letter of Sharia, but perhaps not the spirit of Sharia. That in Islam, as we know, everything is in moderation. And so one of the examples I give is just because you can borrow money to buy a Mercedes, for example, but actually your income only allows you to drive a VW, small VW Polo or something, then you shouldn't be borrowing money to live beyond your means. And so that's where my own view is to where Islam expects us to lead our lives with moderation. And in the conventional world, it's basically whatever you can afford. So if you can afford to borrow money and you can buy a big fancy car or buy a big fancy house when all you need is a 2-bedroom house, but you can go and buy a 7-bedroom house because you can get a mortgage. I don't believe that's the way we should be living our lives. But inevitably, it's very much a personal choice. And therefore, the Islamic industry has had to always try and mimic what is available in the conventional world, because they say that's what consumers want. They want to have the same choices they have as in the conventional world.
In some Islamic loan products, the rate of return or the repayments are the same as for loans which pay interest. What is your view on that?
It has to go on, and that's a problem. Because the world is 99% conventional from a financial perspective, in terms of conventional finance, borrowing and lending. Therefore, the Islamic industry is not yet capable of standing on its own feet and really being able to offer an alternative. And that comes out, and this is where I have to be fair to the Islamic industry, that comes out of the fact that in conventional banking, typically, if you put your money into a bank, you cannot lose that money up to a certain amount. So in the UK, I think it's up to £85,000 is guaranteed to be repaid by the government if the bank becomes bankrupt. In Islam, that cannot be the case. You have to take your losses as well as your profit. And therefore, while we have this requirement of fitting conventional regulations, be it in England or be it in Germany or be it in America or even be it in Mauritius, while we have to fit those conventional criteria and conventional requirements of the bank, we cannot offer truly Islamic products. That's part of the problem that we have at the moment in the industry.
How would an Islamic home loan or mortgage compare with a conventional one?
Conventional and the Islamic fit exactly the same criteria. That if you want to borrow money, then typically you have a loan to value ratio of, let's say, 30%, it could be 40% equity, and 60% of the purchase price could be borrowed. And let's say the price is £100,000 for the property, or whatever currency you want, 100,000. That means that as the buyer, I would put in a down payment of 40,000, and I would borrow 60,000. Now, supposing after 10 years the value of that property has dropped to 50,000, I still have to repay the full 60,000 that I borrowed, even though the value of the property has dropped. Now, in an Islamic model, you should say that there should be some formula by which, if the underlying asset has performed badly, part of that loss is borne by the person who put up the equity, i.e. the buyer. Part of that loss is borne by the person who's lent the money. And that should be predetermined as to what that loss should be. Equally, if the property price has gone up substantially, then the person who has borrowed the money has made a very significant profit. And the person who's lent them the money should have the ability to have a percentage of that profit. And these profit rates and loss rates in Islam are all required to be agreed in advance. And as we're told in the Holy Quran, they are to be written down and they are to be witnessed. So there is no disagreement and no arguing at the end of a investment period to say, well, how much do you owe me or how much do I owe you? It's all pre-agreed in advance as to how the profit split will be. And that's essentially the Islamic model, a way of having a profit split or a split of the losses, depending on what happens with the underlying activity that the money is being used for.
If you could perhaps give us some of the future developments that you see in Islamic finance and Islamic banking.
I think, sadly, the reality is that whilst we remain in a hugely conventional world, the challenge is going to be able to offer truly Islamic products. But inevitably, we will see a growth because part of it has already begun. The other area of investment, of course, is that Islamic finance does not allow any immoral activity, investment in moral activity, whether it's gambling or insurance or banking or other un-Islamic activities. Islam does not allow investments in those. And we've now seen this huge growth in the ESG, the environmental sector, where people are looking at how their money is invested, and they want to make sure it's invested for a better return, not just financially, but a better investment thesis in the environment that we're living in now. So we shouldn't be investing in defense companies, tobacco companies, companies which do harm to society, and companies which do morally damaging activities. And Islam requires you to only invest in those companies which do good and have the mandate to do good things and fair activities in the economy. So that, again, was something that started in the Islamic teachings 1400 years ago. And it's only now been adopted by conventional finance in the last 5 or 10 years. It's become more important. So we are seeing a change happening. And inshallah, as we progress through time, we will see the adoption of a much more fair and equitable economic system, which is based upon the true Islamic model.
So, some interesting viewpoints there. One of the things he touches on is the convergence of the conventional towards the Islamic way of thinking in investment. Can you care to comment on that?
Absolutely. In fact, not just in banks, but in general, we see banks are leading the way towards what you call ESG, basically the environmental, social, and governance aspect of things. Now, what this is about sustainability. Banks and many organizations have realized that the way we've been doing business and the way we've been serving the public at large is not sustainable in this day and age. And there's a huge portion of ethics which is extremely important today. The banks have to ask themselves the questions, and they are asking themselves the question, am I investing in an area which is worth it? Am I investing in something which creates value, which makes a difference for the world? And they realize that today, with the increased realization of the public at large, to go back to basics and to invest their money and spend their effort into things of value, which will improve their lives in a sustainable manner for the better, while protecting the planet. So this is something which this generation is all about. And banks realize that they've got to adapt, be it for selfish reasons. Let us say they want to do it only for their target market. But the younger generation are about sustainability. And so the way this is evolving, I think, when you look at it, you can call it ESG. A lot of what you see in the ESG space is totally attuned to Islamic values.
To add on that, Shafique said actually in his book, The Islamic Economic System of Islam, the second caliph, Hazrat Mirza Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad, he clearly mentioned that Islam teaches us that, like for example, extravagance, something which has been condemned in Islam, and anything to invest in things which Islam has declared unlawful, like gambling. It is only today that companies and banks are realizing that this do not actually benefit the society at large. So yes, they are, unknowingly they are going back to those principles that were taught by Islam many centuries ago.
Mm-hmm. And another aspect that came out of the answers that he gave was the difficulties of applying the Islamic principles. Is it a function of the context of the current world?
exactly to apply. We were talking about the Islamic banking. To apply the Islamic banking and to find it, fully functional, this should operate within the Islamic context or the Islamic society, or how Islam, present an ideal society. When we plug all these things in that, this is where we'll find, really the Islamic banking system, thriving properly, and to see all the benefits of it. Surely this is the way ahead. But for us to see it, we will have to redefine the society first of all. And we've just touched on that. These things that Islam teaches us that we should not be doing. When we do away with those things, this is where we'd really find then the Islamic banking and Islamic finance, really all its advantages, will come to the forefront.
Thank you very much. I think that brings us to the end of this very interesting program on Islamic banking and Islamic finance. It remains for me to thank my studio guests, Niazi Hoolash, Shameem, Jamal, Ahmad, and a big thank you also to Ahmad Salaam from London. And thank you again for your kind attention, and we hope to see you again in another episode of Focus on Finance. Assalamu alaikum.